Always forget that.
That is fine. Yeah, so thanks, Jeff. I am happy to see so many familiar faces. If you don't know me, I'm Emily Raffel. I'm the Director of Programs at Credential Engine and have been leading our state and regional work at Credential Engine for several years now, and really excited to have been able to do this work in the Midwest in partnership with MEC. We have a great panel today, again, like Jeff said, to focus on micro-credentials. And I see all of the panelists on camera, so thank you. If you're not a panelist, if you could go off camera, that would be great, just so that people can see the faces of the people speaking. Just for some housekeeping, we will have plenty of time for Q&A, but feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat throughout the conversation, and I can try to slot them in and address them as we go. But without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists and get us kicked off. So we are joined by Becky Klein-Collins, the Vice President for Impact at CAEL, Mark Leuba, Vice President for Product Management at IMS Global, Stacey Townsley, Vice President for Adult Strategy and Statewide Partnerships at Ivy Tech, and Holly Zanville, a research professor and co-director of program on skills, credentials, and workforce policy at George Washington University. And all of you have been around our work and around micro-credentials for a long time. So I will just ask each of you to start by introducing yourself and your work as it relates to micro-credentials and the work that we're doing here in the Midwest. And in no particular order, I will just go ahead and start with, I guess, from the last letter in the alphabet. So I'll start with Holly.
Okay. Hi, I'm Holly Zanville, and I left Leuba Foundation about a year ago, and I landed at George Washington University, where I'm a research professor, and I'm working particularly on credentialing issues, on-the-ground issues, and one of the co-leads of Credential As You Go. And I won't go into detail now because I think we might be coming back to that, but very interested in the array of credentials, the importance of them, not only in the degree-centric system that we have now, but really how can we move to a more incremental system that recognizes learning as it occurs. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the conversations.
Thanks, Holly. I'll turn it over to you, Stacy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Stacey Townsley, I serve as Vice President for Adult Strategy and Statewide Partnerships at Ivy Tech Community College, which is the largest singly accredited college in the country here in Indiana. My job is really around supporting, making sure that we have a laser focus on the adult learner and revising our structure and process to support that work. And so as part of that, we're really looking to the micro-credentials, the short-term credentials, the non-credit, the skills credit as that flexible on-ramp for adult learners. And so a lot of my work has been around that. And one of the reasons why I'm here, I think, is because I'm serving as project coordinator on a national design initiative with the Education Design Lab, where we're standing up micro pathways. And I can speak more to that later. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stacy. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Mark Leuba with IMS Global. IMS is the standards body that publishes the technical standard of open badges, which most micro-credentials are using to publish. We are a member-based organization, so in addition to publishing these open technical standards, we also organize our institutional members to gather around best practices and share information about their experiences and try to gradually develop a set of norms that the market would be able to rely on.
All right, and last but definitely not least, Becky, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks for having me. Becky Klein-Collins with CAEL, which is the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. My focus is pretty much lockstep with Holly Zanville, I think. Our focus is on the working adult learner. And so, we work with post-secondary institutions to help make their programs more accessible for adult students and help them support their success. And then also working in the workforce space to connect learning and work in new ways, and being sort of an intermediary between the workforce and educational stakeholders. So our focus very often involves micro-credentials as part of career pathways, and also incremental credentialing that we'll, I'm sure, be talking about quite a bit today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And so I think a good next place to go is to dig a little deeper into some of the work that you all mentioned. So I'd love for sort of each of you to describe how you see the current state of micro-credentials, how you're engaging with different stakeholders around micro-credentials, and yeah, just a little bit more meat on the bones about what you're doing specifically in this ecosystem. And I'll let anybody chime in first.
I'll jump in. So I think there's micro-credentials have been around for a very long time, and but I think it's been pretty much a hodgepodge of, you know, individual institutions putting out a very, you know, small certificate that they might have, and then on the other side, you know, industry recognized credentials where industry associations are involved in the creation of credentials, and, you know, that are attached to licenses or professional certificates and things like that. What we're seeing now is something quite different, which is, you know, post-secondary institutions really taking a much closer look at what micro-credentials are, what they're currently offering, how it relates to the labor market, and what the labor market needs are. Employers, meanwhile, are really looking at what their needs are and increasingly saying, I'm not sure we need a bachelor's degree for XYZ position. And so let's figure out what it is we do need, and then find a learning program or a training of some sort that really matches that. And so that's starting to really try to, you know, shape the kinds of micro-credentials that are available. And, you know, post-secondary institutions are facing enrollment crisis. And so they're really rethinking what their credential offerings are, how they're meeting the labor market needs, how they're meeting working adult learner needs, which, you know, may ultimately be, there might be a goal for an adult learner to eventually get to a bachelor's degree, but in the short term, they might need something that's more targeted to help them open doors for their careers. So that's, I'll tackle this current state, and then we can maybe talk about, you know, what I see different other stakeholders doing as well. And I think I'm going to be, I'm going to maybe pitch to Stacy to talk, because they've been doing a lot of work, and CAEL's been involved in some of that work to really, you know, recognize industry credentials in a very, you know, robust and intentional way. And it'd be great for her to share that work with you.
Thanks, Becky. I will say that I think Ivy Tech over the last 5 years under the leadership of Dr. Sue Elfperman really has been strategically focused on how can we build out micro-credentials in a stackable pathway, right? So that we can be more flexible and meet the demands of market needs, that kind of thing. I think I'll share with you, as a result of that intentional strategic focus, I think more than 70% of our annual credentials awarded are at that short-term or longer-term certificate level. So typically 18 to 30 credit hours. And while that is a significant trend, we also realize that because we've built out these stackable pathways, some of those credentials awarded may not have been intentionally sought by the learner. And so I think the next iteration of our strategy is to see how can we make our culture one that is, and all of our guardrails, our bumper lanes, so to speak, make it very intentional for that learner who's interested in skilling up or would like to change a career, and align our funding, align our processes to allow them to come in, take that first step. It might be an industry certification on the non-credit side, have it crosswalk seamlessly into the credit. Becky mentioned the work that we're doing around recognizing that credit for prior learning. It is robust, what we have available, but the processes for the learner are kind of clunky. So, that's that next frontier for us. And then under this micro pathway initiative that we're working with Education Design Lab on, it's how are we knitting all of these pieces together? And so we've built out 4 pilot pathways, 2 in IT, 1 in advanced manufacturing, and 1 in supply chain logistics, where we're really intentionally pulling together the non-credit side and the credit side. And then we're not throwing in, but really being intentional. How are we supporting them with work-based learning? How are we treating them holistically as a learner all the way through, and not just with the supports that we would had in the past, maybe reserved for our associate degree seekers. So again, I think it comes back to, we have the pieces, now it's the intentionality is where we're at.
And I'll just jump in briefly to say that we're in a mass of using a lot of terms that a lot of people don't understand, and I actually think we're defining them as we're moving our system forward. So there's a lot of wonderful transformation going. I think of it as sort of innovation gardens all around the country, but without a coherent plan or landscaping plan. So there's pockets, and a lot of institutions are moving, a lot of state systems are moving, and I've been working recently through the Credential As You Go effort to identify what are some of the key definitions or the use of terms. And I'm up to about 25 or so different terms. And a lot of them center around non-degree credentials or micro-credentials. And the terms badges are there, and unbundling and modularizing. They're automatically awarding smaller, shorter term credentials. And these are not just for undergraduate level students. There's a lot of activity going on at the graduate level, both in master's, doctoral level, and professional programs, where they're stacking on badges or smaller short-term credentials that speak to skills in addition to degree programs. And I don't think most of us in this conversation think about things below the baccalaureate. And I think that's probably not understanding the level of transformation that is really hitting the higher ed system. And it's not just in the US, this is globally. And so I'm hearing lots of discussion about micro-credentials and how they're going to be put into the national qualification systems that most other nations have that we don't have. So in my mind, this is a very confusing time, and maybe hopefully out of confusion comes more clarity. So lots of us are working on tools to try to help bring that forward. So I would just say that's part of the landscape that we're living in, and things that we need to solve. And maybe, Mark, you should speak now to common standards and data issues, because that's one of the solutions.
Well, I was thinking that when Stacy and you were talking, my immediate reaction to Emily's question was, we see the market maturing. Maybe it's in the teenage years now, not exactly sure, but certainly there are some very solid examples of well-developed programs with explicit goals that are achieving their goals. We have some organizations that we're working with. Wichita State University has done a very good job taking previously non-credit programs and transferring them to more of a credit model in a Credential As You Go model. Alamo Community Colleges, you may all be aware of what they're doing with stackable micro-credential pathways. And we see exemplars like the SUNY system, who have done just an extraordinary job of integrating their program across the entire system, well-documented, well-rounded, anchored in policy, which we feel like is extremely important. So absolutely, the need to have a common set of terms, as Holly was referring to, and kind of constructs, but also, as you say, the data standards themselves are absolutely important, because we're talking about learner records here. We're talking about students having the ability, and workers having the ability to leverage their achievements in ways that has never been done before with employers, and be able to basically market themselves effectively. Well, it's critical that that data be handled appropriately, and so that there's no data corruption or any privacy concerns or any security concerns. So all those underlying infrastructure things are necessary but not sufficient, for the entire ecosystem to function. But we see good things, as I think that Stacy and Holly were implying, and Becky. So we're very optimistic about the direction that things are going.
Yeah, well, I think it's no surprise to anybody here that at Credential Engine, we totally agree with the need for some common definitions and data standards and the ability to ensure that folks are able to describe micro-credentials and all credentials in a consistent way. And I was in a conversation last week where somebody asked, how are people defining micro-credentials? So maybe we should have started there, but how are you defining micro-credentials?
Yeah, I think in the broadest terms, it's less than an associate degree, right? So, and we have different categories that we pursue, but we haven't, interestingly enough, I don't think we've actually landed on a formal definition. We just refer to them as what we call them, short-term, longer-term credential, but not an associate degree.
So in my little definitions document that I'm working on as we speak, I have, 4 or 5 definitions. One comes from Credential Engine. This is very broad. An online educational credential that covers more than a single course, but it's less than a full degree. And degree doesn't just mean bachelor's degree, of course, it means master's and doctoral, et cetera. And then I've got a couple definitions from SUNY, and it's partly because they actually established a statewide policy describing what micro-credentials are. They made the case for why they want them in throughout the SUNY system, what the attributes are, and now SUNY has more than 400 micro-credentials. But what they don't have yet is they're not able to track the student data because they're not collecting data on them yet. So they haven't fixed it fully, and they have a long list of things to do, but they're really moving because they've set the policy and they're working with the faculty to develop these. On my list is also a definition out of Ontario, Canada, where they've done a tremendous amount of work around micro-credentials. And then Wikipedia has a definition. So I'm not going to give you the definition, but soon we're going to put a tool out. And I'm in the business of now trying to collect all these different definitions because, number one, I think it's interesting that they're not all the same. And I'm trying to look at the use cases. How are they being used? So Stacy, it's interesting that you're using it because you're at Ivy Tech in a certain context. And there are graduate programs I know that are tied with medical programs that are using it in a kind of a different way. And we don't realize that we're sort of talking about the same thing. So I'll stop there, but I think we're going to have some tools which will make maybe some of this coalesced information more widely available.
I agree with Holly's implication there about it's too early to try to establish definitions, and it's probably not productive, because the world is still trying to explore what's possible with these small packages of achievements that can be shared. And we've talked about courses, but could also just as well be demonstrated competencies and numerous other forms of achievement. So we try to think more along the lines of groups of achievements, small packages of achievement that have meaning to the market, however that is defined. And that could be one certification, it could be a group of related certifications that are tied to a particular, let's say, entry-level job or even job advancement. So the definition from our point of view is whatever the market brings, and there's all sorts of abundance now. We're even seeing, of course, industry-issued credentials, which is something very important to consider, because we're working really hard to make sure that education and industry are working closely together through a common set of foundational tools, such as open standards. And following what they're doing is very important, I would say.
I like that definition you had of achievement. I think that's really helpful. And just building on what Holly was saying, one of the things that we, with respect to, the ways in which people are combining degrees and micro-credentials in new and different ways I was speaking with one workforce development board leader a couple months ago about their work, and as this happened to be a region where the IT industry was pretty dominant, and so their approach to workforce development is very different from say other regions that may be focusing on people in lower wage work, trying to connect to the workforce in different ways. But what they were finding is that, a lot of these IT workers, when they're laid off, they have a bachelor's degree, but they still, they are, in the fight for jobs just like everybody else. And they opt to get new skills through micro-credentials or shorter term certificates to show that they're, getting, refreshing their skills. And so that gets to your achievement point, Mark, but it's interesting that, again, we're talking about different terms. So achievement can be skill, can be competency, depending on who the user of that term is. But that the workers really and employers think in terms of skills. So.
Yeah, that is a really great transition to one of my next questions, which is, you just talked about one opportunity that micro-credentials represent, which is helping individuals show the skills that they have earned and learned, especially in a sort of upskilling or reskilling setting. But what are some of the other challenges in the learn and work ecosystem that you see micro-credentialing addressing or being part of a solution?
I think the chief one, or one that's at the top of my list, is equity issues. The system we have in the US, it works for some, and it's worked for some for 200 years, but it doesn't work for, I would argue, most Americans, and it's getting worse. And we need a system that is fairer, that recognizes learning as you acquire it and can demonstrate it and verifies it. And all along the way, along your path, if you are working toward a degree, even if you're not, and that's the power of an incremental credential system. So I feel like we need to think about fairness in our system and equity for all populations. And I think micro-credentials are really opening up much better understanding of how we can serve more varied populations in the learn and work ecosystem.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm harkening back to some of the experiences we had at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were really experimenting with providing online short-term credential industry certification training, doing outreach to especially those who had filed for unemployment benefits. So it was a partnership with our Department of Workforce Development in that communication. We were surprised and pleased to see that there was a majority of women and of people of color who ended up responding and enrolling in that program, which for us, maybe they would not have normally gone through the front door of the community college to pursue a degree. So that was a promising example and kind of pushed us down this road of exploring it with more intentionality.
I would just jump in with a couple of comments about problems that can be solved with micro-credentials that maybe we don't think about often, and that is to think about experience as an achievement. Experience that's been validated and endorsed through a rigorous process of prior learning assessment. That experience can qualify for micro-credential, and importantly. So that's one aspect. The other thing that I would point out is, and we haven't talked about it, and I almost don't like to use the word gamification, but there is a motivating factor to these micro-credentials, that when the learner receives the first one, it inspires them to know that they can do it, and they can challenge themselves to achieve more. And so especially the stackable versions of these are phenomenal, just wonderful ways to provide that feedback to the learner. But finally, from my thinking about something that can be done with these now that couldn't be done before, really just leverages the power of the internet. Using the mechanisms, the infrastructure that, for example, the Credential Engine is building right now, and through the power of these open standards such that IMS is publishing, we won't believe the capabilities that will unleash in terms of improved hiring and a much better matching of supply and demand.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think sort of unpacking the hiring piece a little bit more is, employers are increasingly wanting to move to more skills-based hiring, and but they don't know how to assess for skills. And so, the more that a micro-credential can be transparent in terms of what competencies it represents, or skills or competencies or achievements, whatever you want to call them, and assesses for those. Part of the process is that there's an assessment of those skills and competencies that can, help to support more skills-based hiring, which gets to Holly's point about really opening some doors in terms of, opportunity for people who otherwise might be shut out simply because a job might previously have just said, bachelor's required for everything.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add to that. I think for us, the real value add for platforms like Credential Engine and just identifying and associating with those skills with those short-term credentials is one way to get at the value outside of the wage data that often is lost in the traditional ways of capturing supply, demand, and wage, just with the national data sets that don't distinguish educational attainment levels, right, below a certain level. So without getting into the gory details, many of you are probably very familiar with them, but I feel like that is a true value add for the kinds of things that this group is working on.
Thanks, Stacy.
There's a comment about if there's data documenting a move to skills-based hiring, and I would say I don't think there's tremendous amount of data. There's a lot of anecdotal data, but probably the best work on this right now is by Sean Gallagher at Northeastern. So he's done a couple of reports in the last couple of months that have really in on this issue. Yeah.
Yep, IMS actually
and you were with that
collaborated with Sean on that.
Yeah.
My colleague Kelly Hoyland, I think, is participating. She may be able to put a link to the report.
Yep, she's ahead of you.
Okay, great. She often is.
Great, yeah, and that. Oh, Holly, were you going to chime in?
I was just going to say that in working on this definitions piece, I had a conversation last week with someone about explain to me in this person's view what are the difference between skills and competencies, because I think increasingly they're getting very muddled. And so she explained to me that employers really gravitate to the word skills, and they think of skills and competencies as almost the same thing, which is not a problem for them. But higher ed thinks of competencies as separate from skills. So higher ed needs to use the word competencies because it's so tied to the learning outcomes and the way that curriculum is set up. Well, that's a problem if the employer group thinks of skills and they kind of merge things, but higher ed for various, I think, good reasons has to keep separate understandings, but we don't fully understand that the context is determining what the meaning of the word is. So this is very nuanced, and I honestly, I didn't understand it until we had this very interesting conversation. And so we actually we wrote up the conversation that's going to come out in the evolution in another month or so, because these kinds of concepts are really difficult, but hard, but important for people to get more familiar with. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one of the things, obviously, Stacy, you mentioned that at Credential Engine, we're trying to help untangle too, is how do you show what the skills and or competencies or whatever people are calling it, how do you show how they relate to credentials and to jobs, and making those connections for everybody. So I'm glad to hear you all speak to sort of the value of doing that work. And that's something that we've been talking about at this regional level with MEC and in the Midwest region. So I'd love to hear you all sort of talk about, think out loud about what you see as some opportunities for the region to be doing some of this work around micro-credentialing, not just in an institution or in a system, but maybe even across state lines.
Well, I'll throw my 2 cents in. I think what's great about having a group of people connected on this and communicating about this is that you can start to, move some pieces forward. I'm thinking, Holly, maybe about in terms of terminology, if a group comes to some sort of consensus about what terms mean and how you're planning to use them in your work, that could go a very long way in moving this forward in the entire region. I would also say, sharing data on, what kinds of micro-credentials that you think are valuable and why to your labor markets. And then maybe even sharing curriculum. How do you, what's behind the micro-credential? Are you defining it in the same way in terms of the skills and competencies that it represents? And then can you share curriculum to make it easier for everybody to provide this throughout the region so that the credential means the same thing from institution to institution, rather than having a similarly named micro-credential mean something slightly different from institution to institution or workforce board to, industry association. So those are the things I think really strengthen the case for why, a group like this would want to work together on this.
And I would say that on the Credential As You Go effort, which is a national initiative that is working first with Colorado, New York, and North Carolina, actually building on some of the work that New York piloted as they developed a incremental credential framework that's made up of 6 different types of incremental credentialing, and several of the states then are starting to implement. It would have been ideal to have a region take that on, multiple states. And I say states because we talked about policy for a few moments a little while ago, and it's very important for the state policy to be permissive. The community colleges already offer, and are very aware of, I think, the array of important workforce credentials. And that's a lot of what their mission is. But the 4-year institutions are not as aware, and many of the 4-year institutions think they cannot do incremental credentialing. So they think they only have, through their statute, the ability to offer degrees, let's say. So even if a student starts with them as a freshman and they're there for 2 or 3 years and that student drops or stops out, the university cannot grant them an associate degree in many states. And so that's a problem for that student to leave with nothing to recognize for that very valuable learning that we think probably occurred. And there may have been other micro-credentials they could have earned along the way, which would help them in the job market. So ideally, policy is an important part, and because of policy, that requires states. So then I think of, well, states, but then regions of states where they could come together to share the policy language, to share the number of student ability to move across the states, to share common data standards. All those things would be very helpful in helping us to accelerate what I think is probably going to be the 21st century learn and work ecosystem. And we're not there yet, but as Mark said, I'm optimistic like he is, and I think a lot of us are, that we're moving, but we could accelerate this if we could work together more effectively. And I actually think a regional approach with a strong state focus in it is really ideal.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would in general refer to first existing resources. Don't reinvent the wheel. Chances are that much of the problem you're trying to solve has been solved by others, not to the point where you must accept it as is, but to learn from it. So, reference existing resources. And that's what Holly is doing with the library she's assembling to help people understand what's been done before. I'd refer folks to something like, in terms of resources, the ACRO, American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, their implementation guide, recently published for the IMS Comprehensive Learner Record, which is a collection of micro-credentials, is another way to look at it. But some of the thinking and the processing that are required to prepare for such what ought to be a strategic undertaking, as some institutions have been able to pursue, it will be very valuable to you, I think, if you look back at it. And then a big part of that strategy involves networking with your peers, obviously. I'm going to provide a shameless plug. IMS, for example, hosts an annual Digital Credentials Summit, and leaders from all over the community are participating and offering programs and sharing what they've learned in theirs, and it happens to be at the end of this month. So learning from others is a sure way to reduce your own cost, time, pain, and yet still make it your own. As you've heard, it's not a cookie cutter. It's not a cookie cutter. So you're able to incorporate your own unique needs and yet still benefit from the work that's gone before.
I'll just throw out there, I mean, of course, I agree with everything my colleagues have shared. And I think here in Indiana, I'm excited to say that there's something going on. It's in the water. I think we're just all around this, because with our Commission for Higher Education, with some 4-year institution partners, Ivy Tech is coming to the table with CAEL, thinking about how can we make credit for prior learning credits transferable? And then how do you tie that into micro-credentialing that could stack into that 4-year degree, for example? And how are those aligned with in-demand occupations, and that could help people coming from affected industries negatively impacted from the pandemic, for example? So there's a lot here, and I feel like the regional approach, the state level approach is key.
And if I can just add to that, I don't know if folks saw Paul Fame's newsletter this morning, but he was talking about the Ohio industry credential transfer guarantee that they just announced last week. And the basic idea is that the Department of Higher Ed is going to review industry recognized credentials and make recommendations for credits that need to be accepted as in transfer by institutions to lead to higher degrees and credentials. And the first one that they're starting with is licensed practical nurses. So, and I believe that the institutions will still have the right of refusal to say, no, we're not doing this, but there's a lot of momentum around recognizing these credentials. And, even, if it's, taken at a for-profit provider, the license is the license is the license, and the learning is the same. And so the state and the institutions are recognizing that this is a really critical need and a way to really move people along those pathways much quicker.
I'd answer the question with a question to this group, not the panel, but to the compact. Can you imagine a shared assessment bank for the common job roles? Could you imagine working together on what the agreed upon assessment for particular job roles might be? And then therefore, our point of view is that assessments are really the essential element of trust when it comes to the exchange of credit and recognition. Not only recognition across the state, but recognition with the employers. Can you imagine an environment where you actually bring the employers to the table and they cooperate and collaborate on the development of assessment of particular job roles? So the essential quality assurance element from our point of view is a common set of assessment standards.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea and good food for thought for this group. I want to make sure that there's been some really interesting discussion in the chat and want to make sure we have time to answer questions from the audience. And one thing that I just saw come in, which I think is maybe a little bit more of an existential question, but it might be a good thing to chat about, is from Lori about whether degree completion and how sort of state universities are measured might be contra to the idea of micro-credentials and implementing that at the four-year institution. So I'm curious what you're hearing about that at the four-year institution level or even at the associate degree level and sort of how people are talking about that.
Well, I'll just speak up from the Credential as you go perspective, because we're now working with steering groups made up of faculty and administrative folks from the higher ed departments in the 3 states of Colorado, New York, and North Carolina. And the institutions that are participating are about half and half community colleges and half four-year. They're not all the regional institutions, but many of them are. And my take is that they are ready for this. They may need more permissive policy. They need tools in order to move this forward. But the timing is right. I think people are all reading the tea leaves that there are a variety of credentials that have value, that it's the faculty's role to work with employers and students and other institutions, et cetera, to plan these and hopefully stack them. But that the time is right and that we are going to see much more of this. This is not existential that New York in 3 years already has developed 400 micro-credentials and they're on their way, and it is really taking off. And it's taking off in Colorado big time, in part because Colorado also they passed permissive statutory language, which is going to put this in play. So those places that have begun to understand how you build bridges and highways, whatever the right metaphor is, understand that if you position this right, this is likely going to happen. Will it be done tomorrow? No, but we think that this is really going to go into play and that we're going to see a lot of the four-year institutions step up along with their community college partners and others on the benefit of students and because of workforce needs. So I personally think that this is going to be happening at all the institutions, and particularly in high demand academic programs where employers are saying we need more of this, and you've got to figure out how to break these into more, unbundle it and repackage it to make people be able to enter more quickly. And in fact, do a lot of their learning at the work site. It doesn't all have to be occurring on a college campus. So I do feel like that is going to be going forward quickly.
Holly with the exclamation point on that. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Oh, here we go. Anything about aid for micro-credentials and how folks might be able to pay for micro-credentials? I know that's with short-term Pell and some other sort of policy ideas floating out there. There's some potential opportunities, but what are your thoughts, or what do you see coming down the pike?
Maybe I'll start off just with a concrete example of some of the challenges and wrapped in opportunity, right? So Indiana's Workforce Ready Grant has been a fantastic program that's geared towards high demand credentials at the short-term and longer-term certificate level, as well as the non-credit industry certification training. That has opened up, as we were developing our micro pathways, we thought, let's take advantage of that state funding stream to the extent possible, which is what our plans were. The problem that we're running into is the fact that when we build out these micro pathways and we're stacking all of these smaller credentials that have value, students are taking that first step and stopping and going right into the workforce and then not completing, which then affects the completion rates, then affects the funding. And so it's like the employer partner is key to this. They not only could they also support some of the funding, right, and the training and all of that, but to have them at the end pulling that either incumbent or prospective worker along through completion, I think is what we're seeing as key. So it is intimately tied to the funding piece, because then it gives that individual the incentive of this completion is tied to this kind of occupation, which is, you know, I'm guaranteed an interview, or, you know, whatever the case is, we cannot do this alone outside of the employer.
One of the things to get at the funding issue is, you know, the circumstances where the student already has the micro-credential from a previous part of their life, right? And then they're wanting to pursue more. And that gets to the model of what Ivy Tech is doing and what, you know, several other colleges are doing, and what the state of Ohio is doing with respect to, you know, recognizing those credentials, valuing them in terms of what their skills and competencies are, and making, you know, credit equivalency determinations for them, so that that individual worker or student can build on that credential without having to relearn everything, because that costs everybody money. But, you know, that points to the issue. You know, it's not easy to do these credit crosswalks between credentials or occupations and, you know, the academic side of the house. It takes a lot of labor on the part of the institution, as Stacy knows. It's not an easy thing to do. And if there's going to be transparency and trust and real rigor in making those kinds of credit determinations, it takes some resources of the institution. And so we need to figure out how institutions can be supported in doing that important work too.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a really great question in the chat from Rachel Boone in Iowa around models for policy frameworks that might prevent some sort of conflict between the baccalaureate and community colleges and the sort of competition that they might in some places feel.
So such an important issue that they're raising, Rachel and Lori. And it reminds me when there was a lot of effort some years ago on reverse transfer associate degrees, and it was dealing with the community college students who would transfer to a university without the associate degree, and then they could be awarded it later on, essentially when they passed that mark, when they got a ping telling them that the student had completed the equivalent learning that would require the associate degree, but they had to have the data, and the National Student Clearinghouse helped to identify the data so that they would know who was the sending community college. And so that was really great. But at the time, we were not taking on the four-year institution issue of what if you were started at a four-year institution and then you moved along and you were going to leave, but you really had acquired the equivalent of an associate degree. What happened to those people? And some states have permission, but some states do not. And in my mind, this is part of the incremental credentialing conversation with states. I think it's going to be a big issue in some states that have their lines divided more quickly or more definitively than others. But this is a conversation that needs to be had in all the states. So if you want to be fair and credential people, are you going to make them go over here? And you can only get it if you're at a community college, and you can only get this one at your university. But for people that move back and forth, it simply doesn't make sense anymore. And I think policymakers, we have to provide data and show the models and indicate what we can do. And then this will have to be fought out. I think it will be fought out in many of the states. But I think this is what is probably coming.
Anything else to add on that one? Okay. Well, I think we just have a couple of minutes left in this panel, and it's been just such a great conversation. I've learned a lot during it. I think based on what I've seen in the chat, a lot of the comments may have resonated with folks. But as sort of a closing, again, some of you have already touched on some of this, but would love to hear you just share any final thoughts that have come up throughout the past hour, as well as just generally speaking, how can credential transparency support this micro-credentialing work and the work that all of you are doing?
I'm laughing because it's confirming that it's all swirling still. So the credentialing effort, the transparency piece is to bring clarity, right?
I'd like to point out something that Becky was referring to somewhat is the intentionality. What I mean is that we've found the most successful programs are know exactly why they are offering the micro-credential. And it's strongly rooted in their organizational goals and has strategic support. So that would be something that I would like to leave the group with, is the importance of doing this with intention and with a very clear strategic set of goals and objectives that much activity and operational support can, obviously come behind. But that would be my comment.
And I would just underscore something I saw in the chat that Bill Pink raised, which is we need to redefine what completion is. Like if the student intends to complete a micro-credential or two, but not a degree, that is completion. And we should be able to have a system that meets that need. And in my mind, we don't have such a system. And that's the kind of system that we need. And that's what we're talking about, is what are the valuable credentials? How are we going to track them and have data on them? How will employers indicate what has value and how they use them and understand them? And then how does the state policy and the federal funding guidelines, et cetera, support that? And I think that is exactly what we're talking about here. And I actually think the transparency work that you're doing, and particularly the Midwest states working together, can be a very powerful advocate for demonstrating how important these issues are. And let's build some models that really make sense and make sure that both institutions and the policymakers understand this.
My closing thought is just, I think this micro-credentials really present an opportunity for education and workforce to be working much closer together. It's been something that advocates have been really emphasizing and pushing for decades now. And it's hard to get those connections built. And I think there's some real opportunity for education to engage with workforce and vice versa on what kinds of credentials are needed, how to build the pathways from, that allow a worker to build on what they already know and, make the linkage from workforce to education in a deliberate way.
Yeah, amen. I really, really appreciate all of you taking the time to share your thoughts and participate on this panel. It's been really wonderful and has given me a lot of food for thought for how we can move into year 2 of the MCTA and also take this work across all of Credential Engine and MEC and all of our partnerships. So thank you, and we will move on in the agenda.
Thank you, Emily.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, thanks to our panelists for providing that really great insight on so many different topics related to the work that we are doing in micro-credentials and pathways. I'm Sarah Pell. I am the Associate Director for Policy Initiatives at MEC, and I get the fun part of talking about all of the great stuff we've accomplished this year. So as you can see, we've done a lot in the last several months. Up to May, MEC and Credential Engine, they did a lot of hard work at the beginning to make sure that we found the easiest method possible to tackle these large unknowns that's going through micro-credentialing and pathways. So again, in May, we did our first launch. By August, we had our charter accepted by the group, and we actually established our first action team, and they focused on pathways. The action team did some research, looked up some data, and they presented a brief in October. And then November, ta-da, we've had our second quarterly meeting, and now we've got the one here in February. So one of the things that I found that was really a true accomplishment is getting to understand each other's unique goals. We know that other states are different places with this work in pathways, and it was good to see and learn about how states got to this point, where states are, and how can we help one another on this journey. The next one is learning from leading experts in the field. Just like our wonderful panel today, at our quarterly meetings, we've had other panels to talk about all different kinds of work, either at the state level or at an institutional level or organizational level around pathways and publication, just making them known. So some of the things that we're looking forward to and already diving deep in is the high-speed developments in autonomous vehicles and career pathways, as well as cybersecurity. You read something about cybersecurity almost every day in the news about hospitals being attacked, government officials being worried. So gratefully, you have helped us look at those pathways to see which might be the easiest way to produce those and again, publish those so folks can see how to get there. And we've been discussing state and regional priorities. Again, our states, institutions, organizations, workforce development boards, we all have different places, and bringing them together to discuss where they are and what their priorities are has been a really important outcome of our meetings, just to learn from one another. And then we've got the pathways policy. And as Holly mentioned earlier, that's important to look at. And one of the things that MEC and Credential Engine are looking into are CTE pathways, and what states have them, what states don't, what language do they use. So hopefully we can get that pulled together and create a nice policy review for you here in the next year. So I want to open it now to Jeff, Emily. What are your thoughts on some of the things that you picked out as our greatest accomplishments this year?
Oh, thanks, Sarah. For me, I've hoped that more and more folks can connect with others that are doing similar work. I think that is an explicit goal of our charter around networking. And these meetings, I think, have started to help facilitate that. Even though we have this COVID reality and we're doing this via Zoom, we try to make all the information readily available. We publish the names and affiliations of the folks who are part of the MCTA. We have a listserv that we're trying to learn more about how to use well. But I think I can see it in the pathway action teams where people that work on the same kind of thing in different states are meeting and connecting with each other and interested in advancing their similar work around credential transparency, which invariably can lead to new connections. So that's something I'm proud of our first year.
I have a pop quiz for our audience today. And please put your answer in the chat. Do you know how many documented pathways that we've collectively put together during this time period? Anybody have a guess on how many? $700. We have over 700 pathways already identified from the Midwest region. And I'm sure that's going to continue to grow as we work together. We do have a question. Define the scope of a pathway. Jeff, you want to chime in on that one?
Oh, sure. Well, we take a very permissive view on a pathway, and that's because our charge is to provide linked open data on the web to everybody related to pathways. And so the CTDL definition can instrument career pathways. It can also be used for credential pathways, CTE pathways. The 700 we found in the Midwest were primarily CTE pathways. These are secondary career technical education pathways, often produced through Perkins allocations to fulfill some of those requirements. But there's a real diversity, and core to our definition of a pathway is any intentional sequence of components. These are credentials, courses, competencies, jobs, work roles that lead to a destination. So there's both the sequence and the destination are key parts of our operational parts of our definition. But as Rodney mentioned in our last quarterly with NIST and the NICE framework, there are federal definitions of pathways that put additional important quality attributes on what they consider a pathway. And so we want to make sure our work here is supportive of all of those forms of pathways. So anyway, that might have been more than you wanted, but it's been on my mind related to WIOA's definition of a pathway, which has several fairly rigorous requirements for it to qualify as what they consider to be a pathway.
Thanks, Jeff. Joshua, did that answer your question? Awesome, great. Another thing that you have been a part of, again, is sharing the information, coming together and just looking at all the things that you've learned over the years through different layers, coming together and just willfully showcasing those and sharing that information. It shows the power of networking and really collaboratively going into this work with the pathways so that we can provide the information for employers and students that's a little bit more clear. Emily has been very close with the work that we've been doing this past year and has done a lot of state outreach. So Emily, what are some of your thoughts on accomplishments from this past year?
Yeah, it's been really wonderful to be able to strengthen the connections across state lines. That's been one of our big goals, is to ensure that all of you are able to learn from each other and share some of the work that you're doing that others can learn from, and ask questions about how you're implementing work related to education, training, credentials, pathways, all of that. And the other thing that I'm really excited about is that this partnership, this project has allowed us to engage with states that we hadn't yet engaged with at Credential Engine. So we've been able to strengthen relationships with folks in Iowa and Wisconsin and Nebraska and North Dakota. And it's been really, really exciting to work with all of them in those states, as well as our current and existing state partners in deepening our work, specifically around pathways, but also things like transfer and identifying better ways to publish to the registry and things like that. So just expanding our ability to work with all of you to help accomplish the goals of credential transparency.
Thanks, Emily. Anyone in our audience, do you have an accomplishment that you've made over this last year in your state or organization stemming from the work that Credential Engine and MEC have helped with the MCTA? So many things that, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think Jeff was going to discuss, I thought that was on the agenda that Jeff was going to discuss some of the work in Bismarck State College that we've done this year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll wait for Jeff
Tracy.
then.
Okay. That's all I have. And that's a really good segue, Tracy, into Jeff's next part of today's meeting.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and just good on all of you too for helping get us to this spot. So I did want to just take a couple minutes to give a brief on our progress on the Pathway Action Team. As Sarah summarized, we had that report and it laid out these 5 action areas that we're trying to advance. So I'll just give a brief once over of summary of status on each. And encourage folks to ask questions or volunteer any other information that might help us move these 5 areas forward. Primarily, we recognize pathways often consist of credentials, actually. 97% of the 700 some pathways we found have very explicit credentials referenced in them. So we wanted to make sure we're accelerating publishing those credentials to the registry. And that's pursuing through the work Emily referenced with our state partners, lots of system level analysis about how data pertaining to credentials is recorded, gathered, connected, and how that information can be assembled and published at scale in a repeatable process and updated because this isn't a one-time thing, it's an integration that we're trying to provide for the public. And some of the more specific things there, Tracy, you reminded me right away of some great work in Bismarck where we're actually beginning to reach out to the software vendors that are helping institutions manage their data so that we can understand the capabilities of those tools for exporting that information so that it can be added to the registry, or there are APIs that the registry supports so that direct integrations could occur actually at scale. So we have some course catalog tools, some SIS tools that are going to be very important for accelerating publishing to the registry. So that's moving forward. Another with Mark on the panel, some good conversation. We've long had a partnership with IMS Global, but I think this pathways work and the connections with their technical standards is another opportunity that we're looking at trying to make progress on so that all tools can show how they're supporting credential transparency. We also have this interstate pathway work. That's a more focused on cybersecurity and on autonomous vehicle industries. How are those pathways connected across state lines? And there, I'd say we've made the most progress in the last couple of months around cybersecurity, primarily around industry certifications and competency frameworks. We had Rodney on the last meeting talk about the NICE framework. It's a federally sponsored Department of Commerce initiative to define what are all of the workforce needs related to the cybersecurity. So it's larger than just jobs, specific jobs. It's we had a great meeting in January about that work. Large turnout, lots of certification groups interested in showing how their certifications connect to the NICE framework. And we've assembled a list now of maybe, I think, over 400 industry certifications in the field of cybersecurity. These can be important connection points for pathways across state lines. So any institution, Bismarck State, we've done the most work with. They recognize the CompTIA Security Plus certification for credit for one of their certificates, and specifically for a specific course that they require. And that information is all available in the registry as both a pathway and as a transfer value profile. So some of the next steps there are connecting the pathway information with digital credentials that are provided to the student, like an open badge, and having and much of that information for Bismarck State College is actually also already connected in the registry. But we also want to have the digital credential information for the certifications also in the registry. And so that's work we're actively pursuing now. So we can tie off the records that a learner may be sharing with the institution so that they know right away what kind of credit can they expect for their prior achievements. And that's just a general challenge. I know CAEL has done some great work on the PLA boost and the benefits of recognizing prior learning for students, and some of the challenges there about scaling that communication, where many times individuals are needed to counsel and talk to folks about those opportunities, but a data system could scale and help more students in that regard. So anyway, lots of good work in cybersecurity. I will say just related to competencies, oftentimes institutions are documenting those competency connections at a more conceptual level than at a specific granular atomic level of this competency is connected to this course objective. And Josh, I saw you were on the call before. I know PCG is focused on that. There are many organizations that are trying to improve the documentation of competency alignment. And the fact of the matter is many of the tools institutions are using now are not instantiating those connections sufficiently for that need. And so we want to do more in that area too, and make sure that those tools that are being used can publish their information directly to the registry as well as the credentials. So that was a lot of cybersecurity. We also have a whole focus area around incarcerated populations, learning more about their needs. We are learning more about their needs. I would say there's not an obvious connection point for us at this point related to pathways, but we are continuing to identify opportunities there. If you know of pathways that are being created in your state for incarcerated populations, I would ask you to get in touch with me directly so that we can learn more and figure out how best to serve that population. I think it would be very helpful. But I take it, a lot of the operations at this point are not public, are not regularly communicated to the public. So that's one of the barriers that we've run into here. Pathway requirements. This was an element related to how can we use our collective purchasing power of a region to get better contracts, lower cost, better services for pathway visualizations. This is a core competency that MEC brings to the table as well around RFPs and how to advance procurement processes. So we have some leads there that are working towards that kind of capability. I don't think I can share anything right now, but at our next meeting, we should have some more progress to report on that. Visualizing pathways is a complicated thing. There are a few tools available today that are serving that need, but having procurement contracts at the ready will, I think, help signal the market demand for that need. So more to come. And then I think Sarah already kind of summarized our policy work. I know pathways are a topic in the recent negotiated rulemaking federal processes related to that WIOA definition that we talked about before. So I think we'll have more to say this year around policy opportunities as well. So goodness, apologies for not preparing a slide that would have much more simply summarized my updates, but I didn't have time to create a slide. So any other report outs from the group about your pathway work or comments on anything I shared? Tracy, did I do okay?
Yeah, you did a great job. I'm glad to see that you're working with some of the curriculum vendors out there, because it is really a challenge.
Yeah.
They do have APIs to some extent, limitations in other areas. So it would be nice if those vendors were populating it.
Agreed. And not defending them, but I will say one of the things I've heard from vendors very explicitly is that maintaining a consistent data model across institutions is challenging for them.
Sure.
And so oftentimes I think what we're looking at is learning the methods for extracting the data and then a reliable process to normalize it to the CTDL schema for publishing. And unfortunately, that might be some cost associated with that. You know, it takes real people's time to look at how data are being used in different tools and systems. But you know, we're dealing with the market as it exists today.
Yeah.
So I appreciate, Tracy, your partnership in helping connect with some of those groups as well.
Oh yeah, enjoying it.
Okay. Any other thoughts or reflections for the group? We've got just a couple minutes, and I don't have much on next steps. I can summarize it very quickly. Please, Josh.
So, in the phase of work we're doing now in North Dakota, we've completed the Bismarck pathway to the Associates and Bachelors. We're now working on Lake Region's Associate's degree and UND's Master's degree. We've identified articulations at the degree transfer level. So the Bachelor's at BSc is an entry to the Master's at UND. And that way, these institutional pathways can be connected together to create multi-institutional or industry sector or regional pathways. You kind of have to work, as you said, from where these institutions are, but they currently have articulation agreements in many different capacities, and instrumenting those will be very helpful in bringing value that's been discussed in the prior panel. So, why do that is to help the students navigate this disconnected ecosystem we have today.
Great progress there, Josh. Thanks for mentioning it, and totally +1 on your intentions and plans there for connecting this together. I know some of our state partners are also similarly interested in having their existing articulation agreements, often their statewide articulation agreements that might be in statute, having those represented as data, not just a PDF document, on a web page, but a actual data asset for tools. So I'd like to have more of that work as well. Okay. Oh, great. You put the links here for the Badger and the, yes, the pathway fantastic. Okay. Any other thoughts from the group before we wrap up? Josh, you got a question here from Holly.
I do. Okay.
It says, do the four-year institutions have the ability to grant associate degrees for students who start there but are not going to complete the bachelor's?
I haven't heard them talk about that, but I did hear that conversation earlier about, completing a started associates in the four-year institution. That's an interesting question that these kinds of articulation agreements could facilitate. I think somebody has to initiate that process. I'm certain more other people on this call have better insights into that than I do.
Yeah. Well, I suspect there's some financial aid complexity around some of that and reverse transfer agreements that enable folks to earn associates as they pursue bachelor's. So looking for all of these different use cases and making sure that the data elements that support them are well understood. That's kind of our focus there. So thanks for the question, Holly. And okay, well, not to belabor it, but I think next step-wise, we are looking to schedule another call with the Cybersecurity Action Team. So if you've been involved in that or would like to get involved in it, stay tuned. We'll put out the call for that meeting through the MCTA listserv, and probably look for that in March. We're hoping to also have some connection points with the NIST and NICE effort as they update their framework and make that available as well. So I was going to wrap this up, but I was just going to ask Holly and or Sally if there's anything to say before we close. I didn't really track the chat close enough.
This is Holly. Not for me, I just was interested to find out what's going on. I'm guessing it's a little bit of at different institutions, and would love to chat with people maybe offline about some developments as part of some of this other work we were talking about earlier. So thank you so much.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I don't really have any updates to it, but it's those universities, four-year institutions that are indeed in that realm of having this as part of the way in which they were originally structured, can do so as long as they can figure out how to do it internally. But those that do not, it's not a simple process, and there has to be a real commitment to it.
It's helpful, Sally. It just reminds me of some other conversations I've been in where folks are committed to, in this case, it was competency-based programming. But what they were looking at, and this was just more from a technical thing, is that the tools they were using just did not support that. Like there was no way to issue a credential to a learner upon completion of a competency assessment, for example. There was, so all this kind of barriers, real, and in that case, technical barriers, but it could be policy and or other operational barriers are things that are really helpful to just name and call out here in this forum, and try to find ways that we could help one another overcome those. So thank you for that. Okay, I think with that, we'll just bring the meeting to a close. Very much appreciate the panel today on microcredentials. Fantastic. And Emily, thanks for moderating, and everyone for a great year with MCTA. So with that, I think we'll close. Take
Thank
care.
you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.